right, hi everyone. Thank you. Yeah, it's really exciting to be here again now on this side of the mic instead of that side. So Mike shared a little bit of my background, but I'll just add a little bit more. So I did my undergrad in math and physics. Then towards the end of that, realized I liked talking about science more than doing science, so that's when I decided to shift into science communication. And I spent a couple years as a science writer, got some exposure to the journalism world as well as institutional science writing, and then came here for the master's program. And my focus was on climate change communication. And so that's the lens through which I'm going to be talking about a lot of this stuff. Some of what I'm talking about is broader than that, but some of it is specific to climate change communication. And so the perspective that I'm bringing now is I have that social science background from doing a thesis track master's in the department, but now I'm doing very applied, tangible, on-the-ground science communication. And so what I want to do today is kind of bring those worlds into dialogue a little bit and hopefully offer you some insights, whether you're researching science communication or want to incorporate it into more the professional applied side. I hope there's something here for you. And before I dive into the specific context of my work, I just want to share a few reflections on my approach to science communication, broadly speaking. So we talk a lot about, what is effective science communication, but I think something that's often missing from those conversations is a definition of what effective means. You can't have effective science communication if you haven't defined effective. So for me, effective means one, you have concrete goals for your science communication, and two, you are achieving those goals. And so what are the possible goals you might have? I see kind of three main buckets. So one bucket is providing factual information. So, you want to explain the science of how Artemis II went to the moon and slingshot around it and what the researchers are trying to find out, just trying to help people understand a complex concept. Another bucket is changing attitudes. So maybe you want people to be more concerned about climate change or more supportive of a certain policy, or like enthusiastic about science. That would be an attitude as well that you might want to affect. And the last big bucket I see is changing people's behaviors. My work in extension is really focused on changing behaviors, and I believe there is a lot of value in the other buckets as well, but ultimately I would like to see science communication as a field move more towards a focus on actually changing behaviors. And so the facts and information and attitudes do feed into that, but then so do people's motivations and barriers. So that's all sorts of social, cultural, political factors. The list goes on. And of course, that's a lot of what this department researches, right? The social science that can underpin all of these things. And so I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today ties in really well with last week's Colloquium speaker about efficacy, because people want to take action. You saw some examples of that last week, and I'm going to share some more. So just as a little teaser, here are two social media posts I put out through Extension 4 days apart. Both of them are about American elm trees. The one on the left is essentially, enjoy this pretty picture of an American elm tree. I took this photo here in Madison, signs of spring. Okay, great. 23 people like it, one person shares it. About 1,000 or 2,000 people ended up seeing it. On the right, this was a call to action. We were specifically wanting people to report large American elm trees to the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, to help with a breeding program. That got way more traction. You see 570 reactions, almost 400 shares. This post was seen by 100,000 people without any paid advertising. So people want to take action. So my plan for our time together is I'm going to give just a bit of background on Extension and then zoom into my specific audience, and then basically walk you through three big examples of the applied science communication work that I've been doing. And with those, I'll tie them back to some of the concepts you've probably been hearing about in other colloquia and in the classes in the department. So how many of you here feel like you have a good understanding of what Extension does? Oh, okay, only a couple people. All right, I'm glad I have these slides then. So Extension, to me and to many others, really is the epitome of the Wisconsin idea. So the broader national context for this is the land grant system. So UW-Madison is a land grant university. There's at least one in every state. And in Wisconsin, we also have the College of Menominee Nation and Lakota Ojibwe Community College that are land grant institutions. And every land grant institution has the mission of outreach, in addition to the missions of teaching and research that are shared across other institutions. And so Extension has a statewide presence. There are 6 people on my core team right now, and only 2 of us are based in Madison. Everyone else is spread around the state. and in other parts of Extension, there's people in every county. And Extension work really is the intersection of science and society. So it got its start back in the early 1900s with a pretty specific focus on agriculture and helping farmers be more productive in their fields, essentially. And it's expanded quite a lot since then. So horticulture and natural resources are common topics that Extension will address across the country. If you've heard of 4-H, that's the largest out-of-school youth program in the country. It's part of Extension. Health and nutrition and community development are also big topics that Extension addresses. I've depicted these as Venn diagrams because the specific ways that an Extension agency will structure their work varies across the country, but broadly speaking, these are a lot of the core topics you'll see addressed. One key strength of Extension that I want to highlight is that we are highly trusted by rural audiences. So this is just one example. I could pull any number of examples for this, but this is a graph with results from a survey of agricultural advisors. So this is people who advise farmers, essentially, on their practices. And when they were asked about their trust in different information sources about climate change, Extension is the most highly trusted source, even above scientists. And this boils down to the fact that Extension has long-term relationships with local communities. So it's not uncommon to have a single Extension educator working in a specific county for decades. And they build up trust and relationships over a long time, and that matters a lot. So if you're doing science communication research, this is kind of a pitch to consider using Extension as a message source. If you're doing any sort of message stimuli where you have to have a message source, Extension is one you should consider because we are very highly trusted among rural audiences. So I'll zoom in now to the forestry and wildlife program that I work in. There are 6 of us in my core team, and then there are several affiliated campus specialists. I'm not going to be talking about the work of the campus specialists, just us as the educators and the outreach folks. And so we work in regards to Wisconsin's forests, and we have a lot of forests. So currently, almost half of the land in Wisconsin is forested. And of that, 57% is privately owned by individuals and families. And so what happens on that land has a big impact on all sorts of things. And a lot of these parcels are quite small. So this adds up to around 153,000 woodland owners with at least 10 acres. So this is our core audience. And of course, we're not reaching every single one of those folks, but that's like who we're trying to work with. And our overarching goal for our work is to engage landowners in the sustainable stewardship of Wisconsin's privately owned forests. So when I say sustainable here, I'm talking about all dimensions of that term, so environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and the social side of it too. So we do that through a variety of in-person and online courses and events, typically more than 20 events every year, and we have a lot of digital outreach as well. And again, I'll share a bunch of examples of that. So again, we're really action-oriented. So this is a screenshot from our website, which I'm currently revamping, so this is a sneak peek. And these are some of the topics that we like to educate landowners about and work with them on. So all very action-oriented, as you can see here. Now, the demographics of the folks we're working with tend to skew old and white. So 78% are ages 55 and older, and 99% are white. And about 39% have a college degree. So just like any audience, they're not a monolith, but this gives you a sense of kind of the general trends. And so as you might guess, this audience does skew more conservative, but again, there are people from across the political spectrum who we're working with. We have access to some good survey data about what motivates woodland owners from the National Woodland Owner Survey. So we see pretty consistently that things like wildlife and the beauty of spending time in nature are very high motivations for most woodland owners. A lot of them also value hunting and the privacy that comes from having an acreage that you're living on or visiting for an extended period of time. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in climate change communication. And so what do landowners think about climate? Well, it is low on their list of concerns. So if you ask them, how concerned are you about all these different things? Climate change is pretty low on that list, but still about 40% are saying, yes, I'm concerned about it or greatly concerned about it. The interesting thing is that topics like insects and diseases and invasive plants are of higher concern to a lot of woodland owners. And these actually do tie into climate change. And I'll get into some of those examples later. But that's the key point, is that these are things that connect to climate change. They're of higher interest than the broad concept of climate change. Shortly before I started working for Extension in grad school, the team ran a survey of Wisconsin maple syrup producers to gauge their learning interests, among other things, and they found a similar thing here. Impacts of climate change, so you see about 57% are at least moderately interested in learning about that, so there definitely is interest there. But unwanted insects or diseases, invasive plants, sustainable silvicultural management, all things that connect to climate change, higher levels of interest. And we did see that producers were concerned about climate change. So most of them were saying they either thought they were going to be impacted negatively by climate change or were unsure. And so that ties into the first example that I'm going to share with you, which is a climate change adaptation guide for maple syrup producers. This was one of the links that was shared out beforehand. So in Extension, we really value needs assessment. So this is the idea where we don't just go and do something because we think it's worth doing. We first talk to our audience and figure out what's out there and assess, do we actually need to do this thing? And so that's why that survey was run. And we saw from that survey, okay, there is a need for outreach around climate change for maple syrup producers. So one concept that ties into this is message framing. And I know last week's speaker talked about this a little bit. So just to recap, you're drawing attention to one aspect of a topic while de-emphasizing other aspects. And text and visuals matter here. And as another example, outside of my work, you talk about heat waves as sort of fun in the sun, spend time in the pool, or you show people who are clearly suffering in the heat with that big fan. This is from a study that found that showing the visuals that actually are more accurate was more effective for getting people to engage with the information in the way that the researchers wanted. So I want to try to complicate this idea of message framing a little bit, because when I'm doing message framing for the work that I do, I'm not necessarily talking about climate change and framing climate change a certain way. I'm zooming in more than that. So here's an example. I'm always trying to be specific, local, and relatable. So one impact of climate change that we're seeing is warmer winters and longer growing seasons. That then has the environmental impact of allowing invasive species to expand their ranges northward faster than they would otherwise be able to. The economic cultural impact that is most relevant for maple syrup producers is that this can make the maple trees less healthy and produce less sweet sap. And so the actionable solution then is proactive prevention, monitoring, and reporting of invasive species. And so here, when I'm thinking about framing this message, I'm not framing climate change, I'm framing warmer winters and longer growing seasons, and I'm connecting that to the action that I want people to take. Another complicated aspect of this is the actual word choice you use. So in my thesis research, I worked with Todd on a qualitative study of how Wisconsin Extension educators talk about climate change with the communities they serve. And of course, as we all know, climate change is a very polarized term right now. And what I found, one interviewee told me the words are what they object to, not necessarily to the activities that are being done under those words. So Extension folks are not necessarily saying climate change. They're talking about climate variability, changing weather patterns, extreme weather, maybe even changing climate, and they're getting better responses from their constituents. Last year, I had the opportunity to also run a survey of Extension forestry staff across the Midwest and Northeast. And I wanted to include a question, how are you actually talking about climate change? And so here are the results from that. So top two bars are climate change and changing climate. So about 60% of Extension forestry staff are using those terms, but more, 72% are talking about extreme weather and or changing weather patterns. And hardly anyone is using the phrase global warming. So the point that I want to make for researchers here is that the words that researchers use in stimuli need to match the language that folks are actually using in the real world. So if you're researching climate change communication, and you're only using the phrase climate change, or you're only using the phrase global warming, your results are going to be hard for someone like me to interpret, because I know that the phrase people use matters, and you're not necessarily using the phrase that I'm talking about with my audience. And again, this example is specific to climate change communication, but I think you can apply this to any sort of polarized or controversial topic that's going to be referred to by different terminology by different audiences. So how does this all connect to the adaptation menu? Well, again, we want to have specific, clear goals, so here's what those are. So an adaptation menu is not a concept that I came up with. It's something that already exists, and the idea is that this presents possible strategies for adapting to environmental changes. and it builds on the user's knowledge of the land. So that's where the phrase menu comes from. So we're not saying this is the thing that you have to do. It's not prescriptive. The user gets to select the actions that match their situations and goals. So it's action-oriented, but we're not saying you have to take this action. It's here's the actions you could take, and here's how to decide which ones to do and how to actually do them if you're interested. So other adaptation menus that exist that were relevant as I developed this, there's one that's very technical and detailed for forests as a whole, and then there's also a tribal climate adaptation menu that incorporates Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives. So here's a screenshot from the adaptation menu that we created. We have it as the web page, which was shared with you all. We also have a 4-page printable version that we've taken to a bunch of events, handed out to producers. And so right out of the gate, this title is going in the back door. We're not saying climate change because we know, both from survey data and from anecdotal experience, that some producers are resistant to that phrase. And so we don't want to alienate them unnecessarily right out of the gate. In the first sentence, we try to invoke social norms because we know that those are very important for informing people's attitudes and behaviors. So we're saying maple syrup producers across the Midwest are noticing these things. It's not just us as the experts saying this is happening, but you and your peers are seeing this. We're conveying that this is a long-term trend, not just a few weird years that we've had. Good steward of the land is something that we know landowners value. And so we want to directly invoke those values in how we're framing this whole topic. And then the concept of resilience really resonates as well. And that was something else that came out in my thesis research. And so we invoked that in the little intro text here. So the document itself is organized in terms of 8 specific local and relatable impacts of climate change to maple syrup production. And we have a very brief description of the problem, followed by much more detailed description of solutions and trying to build a sense of efficacy. So similar to what you heard last week, people want to take action. Here are the different actions you can take, and here's links in almost all of these bullet points to more detailed resources that'll actually walk you through how to take action on these topics. So that was what I did in grad school, actually, and I wasn't expecting to get the chance to return to it, but then when I was able to continue full-time with Extension, I did. And so what we did as a follow-up was we really wanted to lean into the peer-to-peer learning. So we created a video using 2 experienced Wisconsin maple syrup producers as our trusted messengers. So hopefully you got a chance to watch this video as well. Couple things I want to point out from it. One, both of these folks are framed right from the get-go as Wisconsin producers, and they're experienced and multi-generational. They're sharing their stories firsthand. I only say a few words and I'm off screen. I really wanted to forefront their experiences. It's, again, very structured in terms of, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution, trying to pick things that are actionable. I was also very deliberate with how I edited the clips together in terms of references to climate change. Climate change is mentioned by like that phrase, climate change is mentioned by one of the producers in the last minute of the video. And so this gives the chance for folks who might be resistant to that message otherwise to sit through 6 minutes of being like, oh yeah, I'm noticing that. Oh yeah, I'm interested in doing that. And then it connects to climate change. So maybe now they're more receptive to it because they see all of the connections firsthand. So that is what I have with the maple syrup adaptation menu. The next example I want to share is an outreach campaign around an invasive grass called stiltgrass. So the background here is that in July of last year, this invasive grass was found for only the 2nd time ever in Wisconsin. It's already a really big problem in the Northeast and South, so we knew we really wanted to get ahead of it here. So I was looped into discussions about this. We decided we needed to do a broad public outreach campaign around this, and specifically, we wanted people to look for it and report it if they found it. And so this ties into, again, that concept of efficacy. And the way I like to think of this is an active form of hope. So we're wanting to move away from communication that's focused on problems and stops there. You don't want to say, here's the big problem the world faces. People don't want to engage with that. They bury their head in the sand. Instead, we're saying, here's the big problem you face, and here's what you can do about it. You're giving people tools to take action. Now, I want to just touch on a few different types of efficacy that are all relevant, and sometimes the line between them is blurry, but I think it's helpful to at least know that these are different concepts. So self-efficacy is the notion that I can take action. So we want people to feel like I know how to identify stiltgrass and I know how to report it. response efficacy, if I take action, it will have the desired effect. So if I report stilt grass, natural resource professionals will know about it and will be able to put together a plan for managing it. And collective efficacy, if we all take action, our collective action will make a difference. So if we all work together and look for it and report it, it's going to help us collectively have a better understanding of the status of this plant and be able to manage it more effectively. So I put together a press release and sent it out to a bunch of media outlets, and I was very action-oriented in how I wrote the press release, and it got picked up by a lot of outlets, WPR, Wisconsin State Journal, Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and others. And I also created a social media video, an Instagram reel, so this was one of the other things that you saw. And I was very intentional about trying to cultivate efficacy from the get-go. The first sentence of this video is, there's a new invasive plant in Wisconsin, and we want your help searching for it. So immediately making them feel like there's something for them to do here. And this got a lot of traction. It got over 200,000 views. I still get people telling me, oh yeah, you're the one from the stiltgrass video. And so the video is pretty straightforward. It's like, okay, this is a problem. Here's how to identify it. Here's how to report it. One barrier that I expected some people might face when it comes to reporting is the complexity of the system. So eventually we wanted all reports to go to this EdMaps system. It's an online, publicly available database of invasive species reports. And if you're somewhat experienced in doing anything with natural resources, it's not a hard form to fill out. But if you just love nature and then happen to see stiltgrass, this form might feel a little intimidating. You might just be like, it's not worth the effort. So instead of telling people to do that, we told people to just take photos and send them to us. And indeed, that's what some people did. We also gave them two options of who to send it to, because that second email address, the Wisconsin DNR, among our audience, some of them really do not trust the DNR. And so we wanted to give that option of send it to us instead, because we know we're highly trusted. And then on the other hand, if people don't know who Extension is, then maybe they'll send to the DNR because that's more of a known entity to them. So giving those options for Messenger. So I felt pretty good about this campaign as it was getting underway, getting all this attention. And then we got some comments on the video that I thought were really illustrative about the importance of efficacy and something I didn't consider. So I mentioned that it was about to flower and reproduce, which is why it was important to take action now. And so people were like, well, what does it look like when it's flowering? Why wouldn't you show pictures of the flowering seeds? And I loved this comment here. Make it easy on people to do what you want. And so I took that to heart. I made a follow-up video that was focused on, okay, here's what the flowers look like. The reason I didn't include the flowers in the original video is because it's not actually super helpful for distinguishing it from other species, but people didn't know that. They wanted to hear more about the flowers. So I gave them that and met that need. And this did have some real-world outcomes. So it was a bittersweet, but there were 3 more infestations found within 3 weeks of this campaign launching. And of those, 2 are small and likely to be eliminated. So I want to highlight one more comment that came in through this effort. I'm so glad I posted when I saw this information. Someone found it and had it confirmed because of my post, and another was thinking they also found some. Sharing definitely makes a difference. So here's someone who I think is high in all 3 of those types of efficacy, right? And this is what I'm trying to cultivate in our audience. If we have a future call to action, someone like this, I think, is more likely to engage and be like, okay, I'm in, let's do it. The last example I'm going to walk through is a forest resilience course for woodland owners. And before I get into the specifics, I want to highlight one way of program planning that we use in Extension that I think is really, really helpful, not just in the Extension context, but more broadly. So it's the idea of a logic model as a way of planning strategically. So the basic idea is that you have your inputs, the people, the funding, the connections, that sort of stuff. You have your outputs, the things that you do and who's involved in them. And you have your outcomes and your impact. And when you're not using a logic model, it's really tempting to start with the outputs and end with the outputs. So you say, let's make a video, let's make a podcast, let's do a webinar, let's hold a field day. Those are all outputs, those are not outcomes. Those are not behavior changes, those are not changes in attitudes, those are not providing facts. That's an output. So instead, you have to start with the outcomes and impact. Start there and work backwards and determine which outputs you're going to create based on what you're trying to achieve. So I'm not going to show you all the details. I just want you to get a sense for what can go into this. This is our full logic model for this project. It's a 5-year grant project, so it's broader than what I'm going to share right now. But there's a lot of outcomes we're talking about, a lot of considerations going into this. We spent months planning this before we started doing anything. But I am going to zoom into some of our desired outcomes and how those connect to this project. So in the long term, we want Wisconsin forests on private land to be more resilient to climate change. And we want taking action to adapt to climate change to be a social norm among Wisconsin woodland owners. That is in there because I took classes in LSC and know how important social norms are. So how do we get to those long-term goals? Well, we need landowners to incorporate climate resilience into their management plans. And some of these things that we're going to be encouraging take money. So we need landowners to be able to use cost share funding to take these actions. Okay, so how do we get to that? Well, first, landowners need to understand how climate change is impacting Wisconsin forests and how they can adapt. And we need landowners to understand why active forest management is important for addressing climate change, why we can't just sit back and let the forest do what the forest is going to do. We need to be actively involved. So we went through a 6-month needs assessment process for this. And my colleague Keith Phelps is really the one who has been spearheading this project. I've been a close collaborator the whole way, but he's the one who's had a lot of the really important insights and vision, has been carrying it forward. And he identified these 4 main topics that we needed to cover after a bunch of conversations with landowners as well as foresters and other natural resource professionals. So prescribed fire, so why our ecosystems need prescribed fire and how to actually do it. Tree regeneration, which is a jargony term for growing young trees in a forest. So this includes things like planting trees, but also creating the conditions naturally for young trees to be able to survive, dealing with the impacts of deer, that sort of thing. Managing invasive plants to keep an ecosystem in balance. That's a huge issue right now across the whole continent. And then managing the impacts of emerald ash borer, which is an invasive beetle that is well on its way to killing 99% of the ash trees on the continent. And so we have to be actively involved in those forests in order to help them stay functioning ecosystems. So these all have various connections to climate change, but again, thinking about back to that specific local relatable, we can talk about any of these without specifically talking about climate change. These are very tangible topics. So with these topics identified, we realized we needed a much deeper level of engagement than any of the projects I talked about before. So we developed a forest resilience series of classes. The idea is that we're going to do this once a year in each part of the state. So the pilot series we just finished literally this weekend, and that was focused on landowners in Northeast Wisconsin. We're going to move to Northwest next year. And so this consisted of online modules through Google Classroom with pre-recorded lecture videos. So Keith recorded about an hour of lecture content for each of those 4 main topics. Woodland mapping assignments. So we gave landowners a checklist of things to look for and asked them to get out in their woods and look for these things to be able to know how these forest resilience issues are affecting their woods and what they can do. Then we had 4 Zoom discussions with natural resource professionals. Some of these folks provide cost share assistance, some of them provide technical assistance. So again, thinking about those outcomes of we're trying to make it possible for landowners to use cost share or other assistance. And then we capped it all off with a field day to create some of the peer-to-peer connections for that social norm piece, as well as to just really drive home the concepts, give people the chance to see it out in the field. And we wanted this to be a cohort experience. We kept it pretty small. We only had 15 landowners enroll, and it'll probably be a little bit bigger in future years, but still a manageable size. So this is where I'm going to connect it back to climate communication a little bit. When we advertised this class, we had the phrase climate change like once or twice in the description, but the course itself was called the Forest Resilience Series, and it was really focused on these 4 topics. So once we had our registrants finalized, we didn't know what their attitudes about climate change were going to be. And so that's where we leaned on Global Warming's 6 Americas. So how many of you here are familiar with Global Warming's 6 Americas? Oh boy, okay. So this is an audience segmentation tool developed by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication that basically looks at people's attitudes about climate change on a spectrum. And so I've run a few climate change communication trainings for professionals, and when I do those, there are 2 things I always point out about this chart here. The first is that the alarmed and concerned buckets, the people who are most motivated, most wanting to act, that's currently 52% of the population. It's more than half. That's a lot of people who are ready to act. And then the dismissive bucket is only 11%. And that's like the outright climate denialists. So they're very loud 10%, a very well-funded 10%. A lot of them are in positions of power right now, but it's really important to right-size this. Keep it in perspective that that's only 11% of the population. Everyone else is somewhere further to the left on this spectrum. So Yale has a 4-question survey that you can give to your audience to figure out where they fall on this spectrum. And so we were going to do a pre-course survey anyway, so we added these 4 questions to the survey. And out of our 15 participants, 13 responded to the survey. All of them but 2 were in the alarmed category. And again, we did not recruit based on climate change. And then 1 was in concerned, 1 was cautious. No one was in the other 3 categories. So this was super helpful to us because this meant that we could talk very directly about climate change in this course. And now, I'm not going to claim that this breakdown is at all representative of woodland owners, but again, that's not the point. The point was to understand our very specific audience for this very specific context. So people seemed to get a lot out of it. They were very engaged, had lots of great questions throughout, and as I mentioned, the field day was just Saturday. So hot off the press, here are some photos I took. This is in the red, this is Keith Phelps, and so we hosted this field day at Schmeekley Reserve, which is in Stevens Point. It's part of the UW Stevens Point campus. This is Mike Demchek on the left, a professor of forestry there, who has been overseeing and doing a lot of the management for that property. So here he is with a young Jack Pine, showing, here's what it looks like to have a tree tube and protection for that young sapling that we planted. Landowners got to ask all sorts of questions. Here is an example where there was prescribed fire. That land in the background, there was a prescribed fire there a couple years ago. So just a really good way to cap off the whole experience. And then we went indoors, and participants were able to share those resilience maps that they created. And you should have seen them light up. They were so enthusiastic to talk about their land, to share what they'd found. They had clearly spent a lot of time on these maps. And so we were really excited to see that. We wrapped up the course with a letter writing activity. So this was motivated by some research that I've seen that writing a letter to future generations is a very effective intervention in terms of getting people to be motivated to take action on climate change. So we tweaked that a little bit. It's a letter to your future self, and I collected these letters. I didn't read them. I had them seal them up, but I said, write a letter that I'm going to mail to you a year from now about what you're excited about, what you're motivated about, kind of get that momentum continuing, set some commitments for yourself as well for the next year. And people seem to respond well to that activity as well. Evaluation results are not complete yet. We're still waiting on a few of those, so I'm not going to share any quantitative data, but I did want to share some quotes from the question where we asked, what was your biggest takeaway from the course? So someone said, understanding of the process to develop a forest resilience map and how to use it to take action in certain areas. What can be done to improve the land, and that it is possible with time, and that there are people to help. Every action, even small, can have an impact on forest resilience. So when I read these, I see efficacy in all 3 of these, and that makes my heart warm. I'm really glad to see that. So I want to tie together that 6 Americas thing with the idea of zooming in to talk about more specific things than the broad umbrella of climate change. Because there's a potential tension here, or seeming contradiction. I said at the beginning that woodland owners are more concerned about specific impacts of climate change than they are of climate change itself, which is true. I also showed you that data that a lot of people are concerned about climate change. That's also true. And so to connect those, the concept that I think is really important to think about is pluralistic ignorance. So if that breakdown from the 6 Americas surprised you at all, I'm going to share a little bit more about that. So in that same survey that I ran of extension professionals across the Midwest and Northeast, I wanted to gauge perceptions or misperceptions of their audience's attitudes about climate change. So what you're seeing here, this graph, is showing the average level of concern of woodland owners about climate change broken down by state. So state is on the x-axis, and then higher on the y-axis is higher average concern. So we didn't show this graph to our survey respondents. We just asked them to estimate how concerned they think woodland owners are about climate change on average in their state. And some folks did overestimate, but 71% of respondents underestimated. And so this is a case where it's a specific set of professionals working with an audience that they otherwise know very well, yet there's still this misperception there. And this is not a fluke. There's a ton of research about pluralistic ignorance, not just on climate change, but on a lot of other topics too. So no matter what area of science communication you're interested in, I encourage you to see, is there research on pluralistic ignorance in that area? In the case of climate change, what the research shows is that across many reference groups, people systematically underestimate how many others accept that human-caused climate change is happening, are concerned about it, support individual climate-friendly behaviors, and support climate-friendly policies. So if you want to see some examples of that in the Q&A, I have a bunch loaded up ready to go if you're curious. But big picture, I want you to remember this point, that there's a big gap between perceptions and reality. And so that's why both of those things can be true. People are concerned about climate change. People do want to act on climate change. And people are often more concerned about very specific impacts of climate change. And so to zoom out again to the big picture and what I think are the implications for science communication, I think that our job as science communicators is to help people figure out what actions to take, overcome their barriers to action, feel like their actions matter. So in that spirit, I'm going to close with some calls to action for you all. So if you're doing science communication research, or in fact other research, I invite you to collaborate with Extension. That could be just as simple as a conversation about what are the right research questions to ask that would be relevant for Extension folks. It could be deeper than that too, helping develop methods, analyzing data, any of that sort of stuff. Because we're on the ground doing locally relevant work, so think about what locally relevant research you could do. If you are in grad school thinking about what comes next, thinking about different careers, consider an extension career. Again, it's the epitome of applied science communication and a lot of really, really cool work happening, very impactful work. And then for all of you, no matter where you're focusing, I encourage you to think intentionally about clear behavioral outcomes for the big projects that you undertake, and use logic models to plan those projects. I had that URL up on the screen. I can share it again if anyone needs it again. So that is what I've got, and happy to chat more, answer your questions.